Hi friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today in this video, we are going to learn the formation of interatrial septum. The formation of interatrial septum starts by the end of 4th week of intrauterine life. Remember this timeline. By the end of the 4th week of intrauterine life, the formation of interatrial septum begins. Now let us draw a primitive heart showing the chambers. See, this is the primitive atrial chamber and below we have the primitive ventricle. Okay, and one thing is, remember, this primitive atrium posteriorly it is communicated with the sinus venosus. This is the sinus venosus. Okay, this is sinus venosus. This is the primitive atrium, and here we have primitive ventricle. Okay, and you know the primitive atrium is communicated with the sinus venosus through an orifice. So here we have an orifice or a communication that is known as the sinuatrial orifice. Sinuatrial orifice, and the upper part of the sinuatrial orifice, this particular part is known as septum spurium. Septum spurium, right? So this upper part we have the primitive atrial chamber, here we have the primitive ventricle, and the junction between initially the primitive atrium and the primitive ventricles are communicated with a wide gap. Okay, by the end of the 4th week of intrauterine life, there forms two endocardial cushions, dorsal and ventral endocardial cushions known as atrioventricular cushions. So this is the atrioventricular cushions. Later on, these atrioventricular cushions fuses to form the atrioventricular septum. This is the atrioventricular cushions, and later forms the atrioventricular septum. Okay, so that we will describe later. Now coming back to the formation of interatrial septum. Now look at the diagram. So we have this is the primitive atrial chamber, this is the primitive ventricle, and we already know there is the atrioventricular cushions. Okay, and you know what is this one? This is the sinuatrial orifice. At the upper part we have the septum spurium. Remember, this is the septum spurium. We have already seen this. Now next what happens, they form a septum from the roof of the primitive atrium, left of the septum spurium. So here we have the septum spurium. To the left of the septum spurium, from the roof of primitive atrium, there form a small septa. Okay, so that small septa is known as septum primum. So we have, this is the septum primum. So we know that in case of fetal life, the atria is a single chamber. Okay, the blood from the right side of the primitive atrium goes to the left side. Next what happens, this particular septum primum, we have the septum primum. Next what happens, the septum primum starts growing downwards. We have the primitive atrial chamber, below we have the primitive ventricle, we have the atrioventricular cushions are there, then already we have the septum spurium, and we had this particular septum primum. Now what happened, the septum primum starts growing downwards. It is growing like this. Okay, now what happens, the blood from the right part of the primitive atrium goes towards the left part through a gap between the growing septum primum and this AV cushion. This is the growing septum primum. Okay, so this a small gap is present over here. This small gap is known as the foramen primum. Foramen primum. Got my point? Okay, next what happens, the septum primum is growing downwards, and finally what happened, the septum primum grows downwards and fuses with the AV cushions. Okay, just before the septum fuses with this particular AV cushions, the proximal part of this particular part, septum primum, dissolves. That means I am just drawing another diagram just here. See here, I am drawing like this. So we have the primitive atrial chamber, we have the primitive ventricle, you know this one. Okay, so what I said is, so we have already septum, spurium we have. Okay, the septum primum is growing and finally fuses with this one. Just before this fuses with this atrial cushions, this particular proximal part, this part dissolves. Why? Because the blood has to go from the right part to the left part. Okay, look at the series of diagrams. So I have drawn here. In the first diagram we are saying we have the sinoatrial orifice with the septum spurium here. This is the septum primum. Okay, next is the AV cushions. So the septum primum is growing towards the AV cushions. Next what happens? This septum primum is growing and finally fuses with the AV cushions. At that time what happens just before? So before that I already told you this particular cavity where the space where the primitive atrium, right half of the primitive atrium communicates with the left half through which the blood passes, is this particular part was the foramen primum. Okay, so then when this septum primum, we can see here, fuses with the AV cushions, what happens? The proximal part of the septum primum dissolves and a new gap is formed here known as the foramen secundum. Let me draw one more diagram over here. So here let us draw all the details. Okay, so here we have the primitive atrial chamber I am having. Then we have the sinoatrial orifice. Then here we have the lower half, we have the primitive ventricles. This is the AV cushions we have. Okay, next actually the septum primum. We have the septum primum and this particular part is known as the foramen secundum. Next what happens actually, there form a second septum from the roof of the primitive atrial chamber in between the septum primum and the septum spurium. Okay, a new septum is formed over here. This new septum is known as the septum secundum. This septum secundum, what happens? It grows downwards towards the atrioventricular cushions. Okay, so this a septum later forms over here. This is known as a septum intermedium. Okay, so these atrioventricular cushions fuses and forms the septum intermedium because it is formed between the atrium and the ventricle. Okay, it lies in between atrium. That is why it's known as septum intermedium. So what happens? Next stage, this septum secundum grows and towards the septum intermedium. Okay, next stage, at that time what happens actually, this particular blood from the right half of the primitive atria passes through the slit which is formed between the septum secundum and the septum primum. Okay, and this particular gap is known as the foramen ovale. So this septum or this slit like opening which is formed here is known as the foramen ovale. And just before the birth, what happens? This particular septum secundum overlaps and fuses with the septum primum. Okay, so I am just drawing here. Just see here we have the primitive atrial chamber. So we have the primitive ventricle chamber and here we have the septum intermedium. Okay, so from here we have the septum primum. Okay, and the septum secundum is formed over here. See, that means the gap is obliterated by the overlapping of these two. Okay, and the interatrial septum is formed.